things. Welcome to the podcast, everybody. It's me. It's Aaron. It's solo. It's Mr. Brandon Maddox, the CEO of Silencer Central. We're going to get into his amazing story here in a second. You already heard all of his backstory and his bona fides on the pre-roll, but we're going to start talking about all of that stuff right now. Just a quick reminder, go over to onesready.com. You can find us wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Make sure to check out our YouTube channel. With that out of the way, Mr. Maddox, thanks so much for showing up. How are you, sir?
Good. Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate the opportunity.
Outstanding. No, it's amazing. The second that I was introduced, shout out to Baker. The second he was like, hey, this guy is amazing, a staunch Second Amendment advocate, staunch, resistor of the ATF, as it were. And the fact that these regs inside and out and have made that your career after another career, which is really hard to get into. And obviously we connected. So for everybody that's out there that doesn't quite know, who you are and what your story is, just give us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. Yeah. Good question. So, I was born and raised in the Southeast. My dad was in the Army, so I was born at Fort Rucker. And then we moved to Georgia, and I did pretty much high school and college in North Carolina. So I did undergrad in pharmacy school at Chapel Hill. And then I went into the pharmaceutical industry and started in Florida and did really well. And they brought me in the corporate office, which was in North Carolina. And they paid for me to do my MBA because they said everyone saw me as a sales guy. I need to be a business guy. So
right.
Paid for me to get my MBA at Duke. And then I ended up marrying a gal from South Dakota. So that's how I ended up here in South Dakota. But really spent my first career, I keep my pharmacy license up, but arguably I don't really use it. I keep it up in North Carolina where I went to school, Florida where my first job was, and then here in South Dakota. Once I married my wife, her family was big into firearms. And I would say my parents weren't necessarily into firearms, but there was a genetic disposition there with my granddad and uncle being into firearms. And once I got to meet her family, I got into firearms more. I started prairie dog hunting, and I'm super competitive. So I was like, okay, I enjoy shooting prairie dogs, but I want to shoot more prairie dogs. So I came up with the idea of using a suppressor, would make it a little bit quieter so that when you shoot, they don't really know what's going on, and bought one and loved it. And the process locally was horrible. So I decided to get my own license and honestly just have the license so I could buy them for myself. And the license is kind of expensive. So I thought, gosh, I should probably sell a few to some buddies just to compensate for the price that I'm paying for the license to make it more legitimate. And I just ended up making the process really easy for people to get suppressors. And I started working gun shows and then farm shows and then sportsman shows. And then I started to sell silencers. It's like a handgun you have to buy from a dealer that's licensed in a state where you're a resident. And, of course, military and college students kind of have dual residency in 2 states, whatever their home state is, plus wherever their papers put them, but their orders. But so I just gradually grew it. Started out with 1 state in South Dakota, worked shows here. Then I got North Dakota, then I got Nebraska, and then I got Montana. And, before you know it, because it basically became an events company where we would work events, and I would work events every weekend. And I got up to about 12 states, that sort of 4.5 hour radius of where I live here in South Dakota. Because when I first started, they were illegal in Minnesota and also Iowa. So I started in 2005. So back then they were illegal, but once that opened up, it helped. But I got to about 12 states. I got pretty comfortable just working events and kind of that 4.5, 5 hour drive radius. And then, just going to meetings within the industry, I could tell sort of like, dude, you got a really good business model. You've got it figured out. Why don't you just get a license in every state? And so I took that pressure personally and said, yeah, you're right, I should. So then eventually I scaled it up, and now we're in all 42 states where silencers are legal. So the way it works is a customer buys a suppressor from us on our website or over the phone, and we process the paperwork in South Dakota. And then once it's approved, we process the paperwork in the state they live in. So for you, it would be like Nevada. We would do the paperwork, and then we would just ship it to your front door from there. So it's definitely a different business model. I feel like it kind of is into the same area where a lot of e-commerce is, sort of direct to consumer, sort of like Amazon. You buy something from your couch and have it shipped to your front door. I would say that is 100% our model. You could do everything from the comfort of your home, and we can just ship it right to your front door.
Honestly, one of the most amazing things that I've ever heard my entire life. That is I wasn't even, I was so naive, to your space of work beforehand, that as I was doing prep for the show and doing my due diligence here, I literally found myself just building a cart over on silencercentral.com because I was like, wait, it's like, I did just get a couple more long guns. I am looking for a 5.56 I'm in the market for. So, I'm probably going to want a couple of suppressors on those bad boys. So you'll probably see some email that resembles mine coming across your desk here pretty soon. So as you transition out of the big pharma world, right? And I hesitate to say big pharma with all the negativity that it's got behind it there. So as you transferred over and you got into this game, what were some of the early pitfalls that you see? I mean, I can imagine with the ATF and with doing a statewide or almost like a national distribution model like you're doing, I imagine that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had to be pretty involved in your processes. So what were some of those early pitfalls you experienced?
Um, I would say the first one that's notable is originally I was just South Dakota, and I started working shows that were bordering North Dakota, like Aberdeen, South Dakota, and a lot of people at the Aberdeen Gun Show were from North Dakota. So it became apparent to me that I needed to get a license up in North Dakota. So I was losing opportunity there if I didn't. And it was called the Dakota Territory. So we had shows in North Dakota and South Dakota. So it made sense to transition to get a license there and then work the shows in North Dakota. Um, Once I got a license in North Dakota, I honestly realized very quickly that I didn't know what I was doing. Like I was a little uncomfortable with like, how does this work now that I have two locations? Do I need an employee there? Do I need more than one employee? Like, I just, the whole sort of like structure created a lot of question marks, and I don't like question marks because then that creates risk. So, I literally called ATF because my headquarters for my world, with us being based in South Dakota, is St. Paul, Minnesota. So I called there, and they were very nice. They just said, "Hey, silencers are illegal in Minnesota. We don't really know a whole lot about them. We haven't really inspected anyone with them because they're mostly illegal in our geography. We can't really help you." I was like, "Okay." They were like, "Maybe call the National Firearms branch up in West Virginia." So I called up there, and they're not really set up either for feedback and to give you direction. So what I did is I hired a consultant through the National Shooting Sports Foundation. It's a great sort of offering they make where they will actually subsidize a large percentage of the cost for you to bring a retired ATF, sort of senior level person to your location. And that person stayed at my location for 2 days, and he did an amazing job of scaring the absolute hell out of me.
Sure. Yeah. Right.
I mean, he did a great job of saying, if you don't fix this, you're going to be wearing an orange jumpsuit. And if you don't do this, and I mean, at the time, I remember calling my lawyer. I was like, really, am I this bad? He goes, no. He's like, he's doing the right thing though. He's got you focused on, the take home for me was, ATF's not going to come to you and say, hey, here's what you should have been doing. They're going to come to you and, basically drop the hammer on you, saying, hey, you should have known this. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. So it honestly created a sense of urgency for me as to either I need to get out of this and focus on pharmacy and pharmaceuticals, or I need to really immerse myself in the whole compliance arena. And so what I did is just double down and totally focused on the compliance arena. Anytime there is a meeting where ATF is speaking and it's the leadership or the people from headquarters, I'm always on the front row and I'm always taking notes. So I've been doing that for, 15, plus years now. And I would say pretty much everyone at a senior level at ATF knows me because of that. And I've always been very respectful. I don't mind giving them pushback. So we've had sort of a professional relationship. But I would say that was the first time that the reality sort of set into me that I didn't really know what I was doing and I need to figure out what I was doing. So I didn't get in trouble or, create more risk for my company. But I would say that was the first sort of, struggle. I guess another interesting struggle was I'd been given direction out of St. Paul office as the way they wanted me to handle particular paperwork. And then when I got a license in Nebraska, the Kansas City people came over and told me something completely different. So I'm like, okay, this,
Shocker. Shocker.
yeah,
You're telling me that a bureaucratic government agency wasn't consistent across the board and it was largely personality driven? That's crazy.
yeah, totally. I mean, it was interesting because of course, I didn't really want to ask the ATF who's right because I knew that they would come back and say that the guy in Kansas City was right. Then I was going to have to implement it throughout.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I did send a letter and ask them who's right. They did say Kansas City's right. So, this is basically DC trumping St. Paul and saying what I need to do. So of course we implemented that, but, we still challenged them because we felt like the underlying law they were quoting wasn't solid. And, my lawyer basically said the only way you're going to get them to respond, because I would send them a letter and they just don't respond. I mean, they're
Sure.
one of my buddies is like, they have a monopoly on interpreting the rules. I mean, what a great, situation to be in. So the attorney I hired said the only way ATF's going to respond to your letter is if you put it on U.S. Senator Thune's letterhead, who's the top senator from a seniority and potentially now maybe be the top Republican for all senators. I think it's up for vote after the election this year. But So then I had to go and meet with his staff and convince him, but I did convince them to put it on. He put a letter on my behalf, kind of on his letterhead, sent it to ATF. Also, I recommended we send it to FBI because it was around background checks. And what I loved is within a week of me sending the letter, the FBI sent a letter back, said, actually, we agree with Mr. Maddox that he shouldn't be doing background checks because the theory is that the FBI gives you access to the database to do background checks, but if you use it unlawfully, you could lose your ability to do background checks, and then you could lose your license because you can't, basically do background checks on potential buyers. So, no, it was funny. It was interesting. I loved obviously that the FBI agreed with me. ATF still didn't ever really respond until they changed the law, and once they changed the law the way they wanted it, when Obama got in office, then they followed up with a letter and basically, said, hey. They didn't say, "Hey, the law changed," and year and a half after you sent us the letter, but they basically said, "Here's the way it's got to be." So,
Sure.
but no, there's been some interesting. I would say that probably a different approach. I've just always tried to be very professional with them. They typically wear suits when I meet with them, so I wear a suit, and it's it's been a give or take relationship. Sometimes they find issues, and it's like, all right, how do we resolve them? And in most cases, they've been fairly receptive to sit down and try to figure it out.
So I know the connective tissue isn't really that strong, right? Even when we talked, previously to you coming on the podcast, you were like, "Hey, I was born in the military, but I wasn't really in the military, and I don't know how I'm going to talk." Everybody out there that's listening right now, I'm just ticking off in my head all of the same problems and issues that you have had that they are having as they're getting ready to take the next step to go into the military for them. I hear,
Sure.
understanding the rules and regulations, having these
Yes.
conversations with people, and sometimes, you can be right, you can be righteous, and someone
Yeah.
can still tell you no because they have an
Yeah.
interpretation that's different. When
Totally.
how is it, those interactions that you had with these agencies when they would tell you no, what did you find was the best way? Now you said, mirroring what they're wearing and wearing a suit or going
Yeah.
in there like, hey, read the room, Bob. That's some
Yeah.
basic,
Yeah.
information
Yeah.
for adults that you'd have to, walk into the room and be like, hey, wait a second. you know
Yeah.
what did you find that were some other helpful techniques when you were talking to these agencies? Because again, the stakes for you were pretty high. The stakes for
Yeah.
us when we talk about people going into the military. Okay, if you don't know the uniform regulation, the first sergeant might come over and yell at you, right?
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
you, if you don't know the regulation, you could very well end up in federal prison, which isn't the coolest thing ever. The kids would say that that's not vibes at all.
Yeah.
So, what did you find were some helpful techniques in these negotiations that ended up being positive?
It's interesting to me. One thing I did find is what I was trying to do with ATF was very unique. It's not something they were familiar with. So what I sensed a lot of times is they wanted to tell me no because they maybe didn't understand what we were doing, or they maybe just didn't have a clear clarification. Um, Typically, it seems like I found more so working with the government than outside the government. That again, I came from the pharmaceutical industry where margins are really good on pills. So typically they could afford to hire the best of the best. And I'm not saying that some of the government employees at ATF weren't the best of the best, but I do know they get moved around a lot. And, one week they might be in, immigration, and they typically stay in the federal government, which is fine. So, typically I would just ask a lot of questions because if you get too firm, it gets to be a difficult discussion and they get defensive and then they're never going to say yes. So it's kind of going in with that mindset of how do we get to yes here? And you see lawyers put that on billboards, and it sort of makes sense. Like how do we work with the government agency to get to yes? And just basically being nice to them and giving them my perspective. Hey, I understand that you have to hold me accountable to the rules and regulations, and I understand I need to make it where you have access to all that information. But how do we create a win where you win, but then also my customer wins, and if my customer wins, then I win as well. So it's been tough discussions. I mean, I got myself in trouble before because I got to know some of the higher ups at ATF and have a tendency to go to them and ask them questions about stuff when accused of jumping the chain of command a little bit, which I've probably been guilty of when I was in corporate America as well. But I thought it was good for them to know that at least I had the ear of the people at the top because most of them I had at one point. He's the number 2 guy at ATF now, but at one point he was the number 1 guy, and he actually came and visited our facility in South Dakota. And I liked the guy. I mean, we built good rapport, in my opinion. And so at times, I mean, obviously I didn't ever ask him process things, but if I was in town and meeting with ATF, I'd say, hey, I'm in town, maybe we could get together. And I sensed they didn't necessarily like that. But no, I mean, to your question, I think part of it is just asking questions so that they realize you're not going to give up because I think the easy part is when someone gives you pushback. it's easy to say, okay, well, I guess I got to do what they got to say. And again, I don't know anything about the military. That might be the worst advice. But typically with the government, I find that they can be very rigid, but just ask more questions and just say, hey, I want to make sure I'm in understanding this, 100%, because I don't want to do anything wrong where either one of us are, you know, out of bounds, that we didn't have a clear discussion, and just get them to reiterate it, explain to you why, and help you understand. And then, sometimes that'll open a door where you can sort of say, hey, well, have we ever thought about doing it this way? Or have you ever seen anyone else be able to do it this way? It's almost asking, because it seems like with government, I love to find a precedent. Is someone else doing it this way or similar way? Because if they are, then you're going to get more comfortable with me doing it that way, because it's already a process that's sort of approved in the current, sort of bureaucracy. But I mean, and again, just being polite and respectful and just not getting defensive, or, that's probably the best advice I have.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, you nailed the military. Is in my 22 years, I was a habitual chain jumper as well. So don't worry about that. You go right to the top. That's when people get upset at that. That's mostly ego, and ego doesn't
Yeah.
really have a place in what we're doing here. So you can
Yeah, totally.
pretty much just dismiss it. So
Yeah.
you eat dinner with whoever you want there, sir.
Yeah, totally.
So just as I was looking up here, so the 8 states that silencers are still illegal: California, of course, Delaware, Hawaii, Illinois, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, and the District of Columbia. Since 2005, when you started, I imagine that there was a huge evolution. I mean, I've seen the evolution in gun culture and pro Second Amendment. I've been a staunch, supporter of the Constitution of the United States of America. You can see it's right there. How the evolution of your space since 2005 to now, would you say that it is getting more inclusive of gun ownership and people owning things like suppressors, or do you think it's become more restricted?
Yeah, I think one of the recent changes, we're getting approvals back here. So when someone buys a silencer, our average approval time for a person that buys as an individual is 4 days. So that is just skyrocketed demand. So, but no, if you look at the last, I'd say 2009, 2010 is when it really took off. And I think it was a function of education. A lot of people just thought silencers were illegal. Even in South Dakota, which is a very red state, I would find that working shows, almost 100% of people thought they were illegal. So it's kind of weird to be selling something that everyone's like, dude, you're going to get in trouble. What are you doing? So that was the big push of telling people they're lawful. But then the other big push was a lot of states lowered the um, either there was no laws in place, or it wasn't clear if you could hunt with them. And now 41 of the 42 states you can hunt with silencers. So I think even like North Dakota came out with a law saying it's lawful to hunt with them, even though before there was no law against it, just to make it a little bit clearer, so people, I guess, felt more comfortable. It's probably good government too, just so that people knew they could exercise that right if they wanted to. It's definitely gotten better. I mean, oddly enough, speaking of North Dakota, I first started, believe it or not, North Dakota had a law in the statutes that it said that if someone bought a machine gun, a short barrel rifle, or a silencer, that as soon as they got their paperwork, they had to send a copy of it to the Department of Criminal Investigation. And when I called the DCI underneath the Attorney General's office, they're like, well, of course the customer would never do that. That is incumbent upon the dealer. So I'm like, okay, so now I've inherited a new role by calling you guys. I eventually worked with the NRA to get that taken away, but I used to have to send literally a copy, and of everyone that got approved, I had to send them, and I felt a little uncomfortable doing that because it's considered a tax form. It's like sending someone's tax return to the state, and I just told the state my concern is I don't want, God forbid, someone anti-gun gets elected to be governor of North Dakota. I don't know how long from now, and they have a whole file drawer of everyone that's ever been approved for an NFA item. So, but to answer your question, I do feel like it's gotten better. I mean, I would say that one of the objectives of Silencer Central has been to make the process easier to buy a suppressor, and by us sort of streamlining the process has also helped to gain access and improve people's access to getting more silencers.
Welcome back, everybody. We had a little technical difficulties, but Brandon, as an aside, it's pretty funny. You can watch some of our episodes and there'll be a lag. And then until we figured Riverside out, I'll sit over here and I'll be like, oh, these guys are lagging. What's going on? And then you can actually see me reacting like that in real time.
Yeah,
and it's
sure.
hilarious. Yeah, nothing makes me cringe harder than watching myself do something stupid on the internet. But I've got 350 episodes of me doing that. So there you go. So as we were talking about it, we talked about those 8 states where silencers are illegal, and that's unfortunate. I think that's a violation of the Second Amendment straight up. I think you should be able to get any arms that you want. That's a personal opinion of mine. Those 8 states that silencers are still illegal to possess, to include the District of Columbia. Are there any states that are close to legalizing it? Are those states getting closer to right, or no?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, you had asked earlier, has it gotten better or gotten worse? I mean, like I said, I've seen several states open up since I've been doing it since 2005, but these last holdout states, a lot of them are Democrat controlled, Senate, House. And, I know there's some lawsuits that are pretty heavy in Illinois. And the contention there is that the Second Amendment, through, I think it was a recent Bruin, where it said that, if it's a standard firearm, it's not used by the military, but it's, in common use. Then if it's in common use, and I forgot the numbers specifically, they gave an example, but there's about 4 million silencers in common use. So arguably it's not just for the military. So the hope is that they could, basically tell Illinois that you can't ban them because the Second Amendment protects them. My concern would be maybe they would throw a tax on it, or, they would make they would make it harder, but that would be definitely great. I think that, if any educated person sits down and looks at the data, there's not really a public safety issue. Hear people often reference that if you go overseas into Europe, you can buy a silencer over the counter. They're not even serialized. So, um, it's still a challenge, but I would say Illinois, just because they have a lot of lawsuits there, I think has a potential. Oddly enough, they're available in New York for police officers. So a police officer can actually buy one and possess them as long as they're on staff with the police, which is kind of a random. Haven't completely figured it out. I didn't want to get an FFL up there just for that small market, but yeah, I'm hopeful that more states will add it. I'll tell you some legislation we're looking at is everyone that buys a silencer has to pay a $200 tax stamp. Goes directly to the Treasury. And what we're trying to do is move that money over to conservation. And by moving it to conservation, all that money goes to the state level. And then basically what you could create a scenario, well, if Illinois doesn't have them illegal, then if they're illegal in Illinois, then you don't get the $200. So we're trying to use some stuff that would also work. The reverse is true as well, that if these 42 states that do have them that are lawful there, and they're getting tax money, some of that tax money coming back to them to run their game fishing parks, do some of their conservation efforts, build gun ranges, things like that, then it's less likely the state would want to make them illegal because then they would lose that money. So we're trying to do some angles with that I think would preserve the ability to use it, but then also put us in a better position in the future if someone tried to make it illegal.
Sure. What's the reasoning? And I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of any government agency, or this is obviously your own personal opinion. But what's the reasoning behind denying citizens the ability to buy their own silencer?
I think that Hollywood didn't do us any favors. Hollywood's kind of got people convinced that they're silent, like you don't hear a sound.
Right.
So I think that's the biggest obstacle. People just, um, I think about even my parents. I feel like they're fairly well educated. When I told them I was going to sell silencers for a living, they looked at me like, "Wow, what are you thinking?" Like, so I get it. There's like a negative perception out there. I think it just takes time. I think that as more people own them and more people talk to elected officials and people see they're not a public safety issue, hopefully it'll turn around where one day they won't be as highly regulated as they are now. Maybe the next step would be to come in and be treated as a regular firearm and have the same sort of regulations as, say, like a handgun would have. I'd see that as probably the next phase, but I think it's 100% not being educated on it. Because if I ever read an article about a crime with a suppressor or silencer, almost 100% of the time it's something they made themselves, or they didn't go
Mhm.
through the process that the government has to buy it. So it just shows me there's really no public safety issue. And when it is, those people are going to do whatever they want anyway because they made their own and didn't go through the process.
Right. Yeah. And it's the self-licking ice cream cone, right? Like, we're going to deny citizens the ability to have these law-abiding citizens. We're going to not deny them or make the process, as you said, too onerous to actually own one, right? Like, if I have to go
Yeah,
through all these,
totally.
it's like getting a concealed carry permit in New York. The process is
Yeah,
so onerous up there that it actually prevents people. That's a sneaky little way that the government will stop you from doing something like that. Um,
totally.
yeah. So, quick little transition here. I do want to bring something up, and I hope that you're embarrassed by it. But you were awarded the Pioneer Award from the NRA in 2024. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, good question. I was shocked when they told me that I'd been nominated, and they were looking at me because if you look at the list of people that won it, they're typically in their 70s. It's kind of like at the end of their career. So I was hoping that they weren't predicting the end of my career.
Do you think they were trying to tell you something like, "Hey,
Yeah,
typically it's at the end of the career, buddy. So here you go. See you
I don't
later."
know. That's what I told them.
Yeah.
Through my little acceptance breakfast, I was like, well, hopefully that's not the case. Um, if you read the criteria, they're just looking for people that have done things innovative. And I think that, it's easy for me to wear the hat and say that we've been innovative, but really I would say it was customer driven. If customers want the process to be easier to buy a suppressor, we know we get more suppressors out there. And, meet that customer need, it made sense for us to find a way to sort of streamline the process for consumers. So although it sounds great that we won the innovation award, that I got it, it's still, I would say the market drove that. The market said, hey, we're tired of a hard process. We're tired of visiting a local gun store 4 or 5 times to get a silencer. We'd love to have an ability to ship it right to your front door. So I think the other thing that sort of interests the firearms community in my mind is that typically when you see a business have success in the firearms industry, typically they're in a gray area. Not always, but typically, they're making something that's, maybe it doesn't fit the definition of a full auto, but it does have the same function, or maybe it's not a short barrel rifle, but it's similar, or, or maybe it's a solvent trap that's not really a silencer. It's, I don't know. People just sometimes go through these paths where they have a lot of success in gray areas, and then they kind of get their hands smacked for, not following it. And whereas our scenario is we followed the federal regulations and the Gun Control Act 100%. So we're in a good situation where we didn't have to play in a gray area. We took a current statute and then create a business model 100% around that.
That's innovative. I can't believe you didn't toot your own horn, so to speak, right there. But man, that's an innovative solution right there. You literally just used the system against itself and then came up with a business model to support it. And then there's no way for them to come back and shut you off, essentially.
Yeah, we hope so. That's the goal. It just, as it gets more popular, you wonder, are you becoming a bigger target? It really, sort of the backstory is like, so I'm not from South Dakota, but there's a river that runs through the middle, and people that live on the west side of the state don't like to come over to the east side. The west is more conservative than the east side, and it's more ranches west, and they call it West River, East River, and people on the West River don't like to come to East River. So used to years ago, people had to come pick up their silencer in Sioux Falls, or I had to give it to them at a gun show in Rapid City or Western South Dakota. And people didn't want to come over here. So that's why it forced me to call a lawyer and say, hey, is there any way I could ship a silencer to someone after, they get approved from the feds? And, he's like, I doubt it, but I'll look for it. And he called back a week later and goes, hey, I found a statute. And he created like a legal opinion, charged me a lot of money. And, at the end of the day, I was pleased because I would create a business model around it. So no, it was just, again, solving a consumer need was really the whole sort of driver behind it.
And that's why the free market is a beautiful place, everybody.
100%. Totally. 100%. I totally agree.
Yeah. The free market has created the most benevolent, freest, most tolerant country on the face of the planet, and you're living in it right now. Anybody that says the free market doesn't work for benevolence and humankind, you people are naive, and I say you people specifically. So the other thing I want to talk about is you're also on the board of directors for the Congressional Sportsman Foundation. What are the main goals of the Congressional Sportsman? I'm sorry, I said it the Congressional Sportsman Foundation. I said it correctly.
Yeah, good question. So we had a board meeting yesterday, actually, believe it or not, in DC. So the purpose is it's bipartisan. So there's both Democrats and Republicans that are members. So essentially, they recruit members in Congress and in Senate, even at a state level, governors. I think like 32 governors of the 50 states are actually members as well. So the goal is to recruit members. And what we find is that hunting and conservation crosses on both Democrats and Republicans. It's, people will argue it might be the only one thing that both parties agree on in a lot of cases. So what the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation does is by having a nonpartisan or bipartisan type setup with members, and then it puts them in a situation that when legislation does come up that would potentially hurt conservation or hurt hunting, they're in a position to sort of lobby against it with their members, their caucuses. But then the reverse is true if they see good legislation that they want to push through, to be able to have the support of bipartisan in both houses helps a lot. So yes, we had a board meeting yesterday. So we just talk about different issues that are coming up. Like I remember one issue came up where states said, hey, we want to, do away with licensing fees where it's, basically free to hunt. And on the surface, that sounds great. But some of the federal dollars are matched based on how much is raised through the licenses. So they were going to lose all their federal funding and didn't even probably realize that. So just sort of like being the expert in the room on hunting and conservation and how it interacts federally and state level, and being a liaison between all the conservation groups out there. Yesterday they actually elected me to their executive board as treasurer. So I've told my team that I've held a lot of different leadership positions, but this will be the first time I've actually been the treasurer. So hopefully that goes well. It's not a huge dollar volume business because it is a nonprofit, and mostly it's based on volunteers doing the work. But there's a fairly big staff, and they've got, boots on the ground to call on state legislators. So it's a fairly sizable staff. So no, it should be fun to be on like the executive team and have monthly meetings and have a little bit more leadership involvement there. But my goal in getting on that, honestly, was to kind of bring a silencer voice. There were some people on there for firearms because sometimes they'll go out. Well, more so like, well, there's people on there for firearms, but there's also people on there for ammunition because it's easy for the environmentalists to say, well, you shouldn't be using lead. And so it's good to have like sort of science-based people that can bring that perspective from the industry. So my goal is to kind of be the voice of the suppressors, just because sometimes things come up and it would be nice to at some point potentially deregulate them, make them a little bit easier to buy, but then also protect their legality at a state level. Because, 8 states where they're not legal is not ideal, but at least we have 32 where they're lawful. The goal is how to keep all 32 of those and then expand into that 8.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, that's the goal, is to get to all 50. Because again, there's this little piece of paper, 27 words, ends with shall not be infringed. It covers it pretty clearly. I hope that we'll get everybody there. I do want to talk a little bit about leadership, because we've talked about it the entire thing. It's kind of woven into this entire episode as we've been talking, is that, right when you first started, right? You went to school, go Tar Heels, University of North Carolina. Totally. Yeah, go Tar Heels. I am not a Tar Heel fan. I'm an Ohio State guy, but I at least know the college sports mascot of choice. So, as you decided to move over into the space, and, that first FFL, that first license that you got, like, there's a lot of trepidation there, and you have to have some sort of risk tolerance to go into this sort of thing. And the people listening out there, like, we answer the questions a lot. They're like, well, I don't know how to start, or I don't know how to get there. And a lot of times we filter them towards leadership. We say that, leaders behave this way. Leaders act when they may not have all of the situation. You have to look at the risk and decide if this is a risk that you can accept. That's part of being a leader. It's part of being a follower as well. You have, at this point, I'm assuming probably, do you have hundreds of employees now? Or are you more than that? You have hundreds of employees. You're, elected to the, congratulations on becoming the treasurer and the executive board. But how do you lead through such a risky area? Because again, we talked about it earlier, the output of a bad decision from you could mean that they take away your liberty. They take away your ability to engage in society, which is one thing that unfortunately the government can do behind the threat of a gun. When you are leading people in your space, how do you walk them through, like, hey, this is a risk that we're going to accept, and this is how we're going to fix this problem?
Yeah, good question. So, I talked about sort of my first obstacle was really understanding the statutes for silencers, because I honestly had I had a baseline understanding, but to really sort of immerse myself into that. And, sort of the goal, or sort of the position that we've taken internally is we're going to communicate regularly with the ATF. We're going to figure out what we can and cannot do. And then we're always going to do what we're supposed to do, so we don't ever have to worry about, doing anything we shouldn't do. And we're always going to be honest when they call and ask, did you do this? And if you did, here's the consequences. So I think that's helped us just to stay grounded. Is just, again, understanding the rules, agreeing to follow them. I always tell people that when I first started, it was easier for me to take more risk because it was really just my neck on the line. I felt like I could always go back and be a pharmacist if I had to. So that probably encouraged me to take more risk, to be honest with you. Because I would say that is one of the keys to success, is to have a high risk tolerance. Just almost having confidence in yourself when probably you shouldn't have confidence in yourself, and no one else should have confidence, but you still got to have it.
Yeah.
You got to figure out a way to find it.
That's well said. And we tell people that all the time. People, will DM us, or people reach out to us, or, in whichever medium that they use these days. And they'll just say, hey, I'm not sure if I'm going to make it. I'm not sure if I'm going to be there. We're like, listen, you have to have almost a delusional confidence 100%. In yourself that you are going to make it. And if you don't, like, those things are going to start. We joked about quitting, today's Bulletproof Friday. Nobody quits on Friday. But the first time that you let those intrusive thoughts sneak into your head, that's really going to stop you from achieving your goals. Did you ever have a time where you were just like, this is it, this is too much, I'm going to bounce?
Yeah, I feel like it always was maybe pressure from home too. The wife's like, okay, you're a pharmacist and you're spending every Friday night, every Saturday, and every Sunday at a gun show, sportsman show, farm show. You're basically, is this the best use of your time? So you've got it from your wife, who's got, I got young kids at that point. And then you got your parents who are like, okay, you went to college for 8 years at 2 really good universities, and you're doing something that
right.
you probably could have done without ever having set foot even in a high school. I mean, in their mind,
You don't need a high school degree to do what you're doing right now,
yeah,
and you spent 8
totally,
years.
totally. So I felt like there was a lot of pressure in a lot of directions. I mean, even at school, you go introduce yourself to the new teacher, and they're like, "Well, what do you do?" And the typical answer is, "I'm a pharmacist." And it's like, "Well, where do you work?" And so it just goes down this path. I mean, it's different now because we donate a lot to the private school, and people know who we are in town, and so it's better. But in the beginning, it was tough. But no, I had times where I totally like. I remember working a show in Nebraska, and then spend the money to drive there. You got all this effort you put into getting it there, and I think I sold like two on a Saturday, and typically whatever you sold on Saturday, you would sell half as many on Sunday.
Sure.
And I'm just like, no, gosh, is this really worth my time? And
Right.
you get into your head, could I have hired someone that could be doing this better? And that was the problem. I was so good at it, I couldn't really hire anyone else that could execute as well as I could. So, no, there was plenty of times that I didn't want to give up, but it almost felt like you're going down a path of like, am I going to totally fail? And then wished I hadn't sunk all this effort and energy and time and kind of your whole life into, and then you're afraid it's gonna, you're gonna have a blowout and it's gonna go sideways. So, no, that's hard because at the time it's like when I first started doing silencers, I mean, no one really thought they would ever catch on, and everyone thought the process would always take forever to get them. And so for us to have spent the last 20 years building a business where we make it easier to get them, and now the feds are actually approving them more quickly, we're in a perfect scenario that no one could have ever predicted, 20 years ago when I first started. But that opportunity would have been never been available to me if I hadn't put in all the effort and all the
Right.
energy and time up front. So that's the hard part. And I think that I don't know. I had a guy, a boss out of Kansas City, tell me once. He said, "Don't bleed until you've been shot." And I felt like a lot of my life was spent thinking about what if this happens? What if that happens? And you're like preparing for something that hasn't happened, and you're like worrying and you're thinking, and it's so much easier said than done.
Oh
But
yeah. Oh
I
yeah.
try to tell myself that occasionally, like I hadn't been shot, so quit bleeding. Just try to focus on what you can control and move forward.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And again, like I just laugh. Like, I remember our conversation on the phone prior to this podcast. You're like, I don't know what we're gonna talk about. There are so many parallels that I'm just in my head. I'm like, man, people are gonna 100% understand what you're saying. So as a leader in these organizations, we talked about risk tolerance. What's the number one leadership lesson that you've learned when you're managing people? Like if you could give somebody one just little nugget, like, hey, when you're in these leadership positions, just do this. What would that be for you?
And this is for me specifically, so it may not fit for everyone, but for me, I would say my goal was to always show the team I was willing to outwork anybody. And I would always say that, my first job out of pharmacy school is I went into pharmaceutical sales and I spent 4 months in what I would call product training. And in a nice way, I told them I just spent 6 years in pharmacy school. I didn't really need the product training. I mean, it was good to get the commercial side of it, but they didn't teach me how to sell. And so it didn't take me long until I became the number one sales rep at Glaxo. And it was, probably 5,000 reps. It took me about a year and a half to become the number one sales rep in the whole company. And I still tell people to this day that I sucked at sales. The only reason I won is because I would work 3 times harder than anyone else, and I would really study nonstop. I mean, I would listen to audio tapes on how to be better at sales all day, every day, from when I woke up to when I went to sleep. And I would try to put 100 hours a week in, and I was just able to sort of force myself into that success. So from a leadership perspective, I feel like that has been sort of what I've tried to exude to my employees too, that typically I try to put so much into it. And I think people give you grace, but I would say one really hard thing for me a few years ago is I decided to make a life change where I was going to start working out every morning. And it was honestly one of the most difficult decisions for me was to accept the fact that I'm not going to be the first guy here in the morning. And like you said, I've got, a couple hundred employees, so I shouldn't be trying to beat them here in the morning, but I always felt like, drop my kids off to school, I'll be here early and get a good start and set that example. And then for me to start working out, it was like, I've got to accept the fact that I'm not going to be the first guy here. And it doesn't mean you have to run circles around everyone. It just has to, in my mind, show people that, if the toilet stopped up, you don't mind trying to fix it. Or if, something goes wrong, you don't mind jumping in and trying to resolve it. I think that has been, and I try to tell people that too, that really every position here of the hundreds of employees we have, every one of them, essentially at one point, I did all those. And it's not me patting myself on my back. It's just saying that I get where you're at and I know what's going on because believe it or not, I used to do it. It's not like I'm just asking you to do it and not having been willing to do it myself. So again, that fits my personality just because that's the way I was raised. Like my dad was the same way. So for some people that that may not work. I mean, and other good advice for leadership is, make tough decisions and move forward. I mean, you probably see that a lot too, where a lot of people stand around and no one wants to make a decision. And you're like, all right, I know I'm going to work our way through it. Here's the decision we're making. Let's run with it. And that's, you see like these leadership training groups where they throw a lot of leaders into a room and then they make you solve a problem. And then one person kind of takes the lead and says, hey, here's what we're going to do and here's how we're going to do it. And then if everyone buys into it, it's like, okay, this actually worked out well. So sometimes you got to be that guy or gal and make that decision.
A 90% plan executed violently right now is better than any 100% plan that we're going to execute later. That's a fantastic analogy. Yeah. Fantastic.
Yeah, totally.
Fantastic.
Advice that one of my, Brian Tracy, I hired as an executive coach out of San Diego years ago. I don't know how I afforded him, but the advice he gave me in his books were, you got to have momentum. So you need to start, like his analogy was, you got to start running. It's easier to self-correct if you find out you're in the wrong direction. Because if you're sitting on the couch doing nothing, you can't self-correct. You can't fix it. So he was always get momentum, get moving, move quick. The winners are always moving the fastest. You're always, he sort of built that out of my head. Again, it fit my personality. So it was easy for me to execute. But I would say that's what I'm always thinking ahead is, how do I move quicker? How do I move fast? How do I make decisions quickly? And we've tried to, even recruit people that think that way too, sort of that entrepreneurial spirit of how do we make it through this? How do we be solution oriented? How do we find a way?
Yeah, absolutely fantastic. Absolutely fantastic input there. Thanks. We almost always end on advice. I was going to tee you up, but you actually walked yourself into it perfectly. I didn't even have to do it. I just want to say thanks. Brandon Maddox, CEO of Silencer Central. If you go over to silencercentral.com, if you live in one of the 42 states where it's legal, they can get you straight to your door. So the other thing I do want to end on is we were talking beforehand. You also engage and you will give free silencers as gifts to veteran organizations and stuff. So I'm just going to give you a second to plug that. And if there is somebody that's looking to get a silencer from silencercentral.com or you yourself, how would they go about doing that?
Yeah, good question. So the first question. So we do, when I first started this business, my biggest obstacle was everyone thought they were illegal and no one really believed I could mail it to your front door. So we started a process where if there's a veteran organization that's doing a fundraiser and they need an item donated, we'll donate a free silencer, because for us, the WIFM, what's in it for us is we get our name in front of this audience. We also let someone go through the process so they see that we're able to ship it right to their front door, and then they tell their friends. 70% of our sales are like referral and repeat. So the goal is to get them in the system. And then, of course, the benefit is 100% of the donation that you raise, whatever money you get to keep 100%. So that's sort of the benefit there. But, we've scaled that program up. And, I think in talking to my team, we started actually calculating and keeping up with it in 2021. This year, as of today, we're at about 8.5 million. So it's a big program. We've given a lot of money towards. So it's something we're proud of, excited about. But your question on how to get them, basically you can just do a Google search, Silencer Central, silencercentral.com. You could call us. We've got guys here in our sales team that's all they do. They can just answer whatever questions you have. Don't feel like you got to buy. Maybe you're just looking. I do find most people don't realize you can typically buy a 30 cal silencer and use it on almost every rifle you own. So once people hear that, they're like, okay, I don't have to buy one for every gun. That sounds more interesting. And, of course, we do give a military discount. So if you call in, it's easier to get that over the phone. But we manage all the paperwork for the consumer, and then we mail it right to their front door. So it's turned out to be a good process for them. And I feel like doing it for 20 years, we know what we're doing, and that's going to be a good experience.
Brandon, you're an overnight success, 20 years in the making. Congratulations on all your accomplishments. And most, from me, honestly, thank you so much for being a good stand-up American citizen. It is awesome to see somebody that values what this country is about, what the Constitution is about, specifically the Second Amendment. And it's seeing you out on the forefront and doing it the right way. It's just a great example to have. I want to say thanks for your time. Thanks for coming out. Thanks for talking to everybody here at the Ones Ready podcast. I appreciate your time, your effort. Thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, yes, sir. Appreciate the opportunity.
Everybody else out there, go over to onesready.com. Follow us wherever it is that you can find your podcast. Make sure to leave a comment, leave a review. Go over to silencercentral.com and check out everything that they have. I will be doing so myself here shortly because I'm in the market for one of them. And hey, I like to be a little bit quieter when I'm doing the shooting. So silencercentral.com. Thanks everybody for listening, and we will see you next time.